Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Stroke Empowerment Sessions. My name is Letitia Living. I'm a survivor of three ischemic strokes and author of Finding Yourself After Stroke. I am joined today by a special guest all the way from the US. Her name is Jenna. Hi, Jenna.
Hi,
Thank you for coming on today.
no problem. I'm super happy to be here.
Likewise, um, so happy to speak to you. So, tell us a little bit about you, Jenna. Who were you prior to your stroke?
Oh gosh. So prior to my stroke, it happened when I was 24. I lived in Houston. I had graduated from college. I went to college in Mississippi. I studied psychology. I had moved back to Houston after college. I was in grad school, I got my master's degree from Pepperdine in behavioral psychology. I had always been super close to the world of autism from my brother. He has autism. And so I was getting my master's degree in that. I really threw myself into school and work and all of those things. And I was just kind of in almost autopilot. Just trying to achieve all the things. I was living on my own. I had great friends. I honestly was doing relatively fine in life. And then all of a sudden I wasn't. I had my stroke and that threw me for a big loop.
And that was 3 years ago when you were 24.
Yeah, so almost
Yeah.
3 years exactly, 3 years in September.
hmm And so, what happened on that day? How did you end up in hospital?
So my journey to figuring out what was going on with me and my stroke is quite the ordeal. So first, I want to start off by saying the kind of stroke that I had is called a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. So it's a very rare kind of ischemic stroke that basically prevents blood from draining from your brain. So it looks a little different than a traditional kind of ischemic stroke. But basically, I woke up one day with a headache, which wasn't super unusual for me. I honestly was super prone to headaches before, but this one was worse than normal. And what I did to normally get rid of them didn't do anything at all. So I had this headache for maybe 2 or 3 days. It was really bad. I go to the hospital, I go to the emergency room, I tell them about it. And basically, their mindset is it's just a migraine, right? So they give me a pain shot, send me on my way. They're like, you're fine. And I believe them. I was like, okay, these doctors are saying I'm fine. I must be fine. They give me the pain shot. I leave. It takes the edge off for the night. I sleep like 15 hours. The next morning, the headache's back, even worse. And this time it comes with extreme nausea. I'm throwing everything up. I go back to the hospital, and at this point, I have the horrible pain that's just progressively getting worse. And calling it a headache just doesn't do justice to it. I have horrible nausea. I go back to the emergency room and I'm like, look, something's wrong. And still they're like, you're fine. They give me another pain shot. They give me a shot for nausea with Zofran and again, send me on my way home. Um, Again, it takes the slightest edge off for the night for me to be able to sleep. And the next morning, same thing. So, what do? I go back to the emergency room. This is my third time now in the emergency room. And a lot of my memories of this stuff are very hazy. But at this point, I have new symptoms. So, my
How
vision
many
started.
days is it? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh
How many
gosh,
days have gone
this
by now?
the whole ordeal was probably a week with
Wow.
kind of maybe a day in between each ER visit.
hmm
um, but about a week. So at this point, it's my third ER visit. I have new symptoms. My vision's starting to go out. My peripheral vision is just non-existent. And when I like change my head in any direction, if I'm laying down and I stand up, it goes completely dark for a couple seconds. My hearing is getting very bad. I have this like whooshing sound in my head. I have numbness in parts of my body. So I remember it very distinctly. It would start in my face and my mouth and slowly just drip down my body to my feet on one side. It was hard for me to walk, hard for me to talk, all of these crazy symptoms. So I go back to the emergency room, right? And they're still like, you're fine. This time they agreed to give me a super basic brain scan, a CT scan. But they're telling me the whole time, like, you're fine. At this point, they do blood work, all of that. They do the brain scan and they're like, look, your brain scan is fine. like, this is a migraine. You're probably super anxious because of it. So, again, pain shot. This time they give me a prescription for Valium. And they send me on my way. They're like, look, like, here is a scan of your brain. You are fine. And so I believe them, right? These are the doctors. They have physical evidence saying that I am fine. And I go back home. And at this point, I'm not by myself. For this whole week, I'm staying with my parents because I'm so sick. So the next night, I believe, because again, the meds they give me take the edge off the slightest bit. The next night, the pain is back. Just, I can't even describe the pain at this point. Calling it a headache, a migraine will just never do justice to it. The symptoms I'm having are terrifying: my vision, my hearing, the numbness, this altered mental state. I'm confused. I can't do things I should be able to do. So at this point, my dad's like, no, you're going back to the hospital and we're not leaving until they admit you. So I'm lying in my bed and he says, Jenna, like, wait here. I'm going to go get my shoes on and then I'll come back and get you and we'll go to the hospital. Well, being me, I was like, well, I can get up and go to the bathroom on my own. I could not. So I went up to go to the bathroom and honestly, everything just went black. It was just nothing. I woke up to my dad hovering over me, trying to wake me up. I had, I don't really know what happened, but I lost consciousness trying to go to the bathroom. So he wakes me up, he carries me, puts me in the car. We go to the hospital. At this point, something's very wrong, right? And at this point, I am terrified. I know something's really wrong with me. I know I shouldn't be feeling this way, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, doctors are telling me you're fine. You must be fine, right? So we get to the hospital. My dad stops the car and he goes around to open my car door, and it was like locked from the inside. I needed to open it. And this is such a distinct memory I have. I couldn't open the car door. I distinctly remember feeling the car door, like putting my hand all over it, but I didn't know how to open a door. Like it was, but it didn't even click in my mind that I didn't know how. It was just like me feeling all over for like something to open it, and I just couldn't connect the dots. And I'm really thankful I was so out of it that that didn't really scare me, because looking back now, that's terrifying. But in the moment, it didn't really phase me, which I'm really grateful for, because that's terrifying. Anyway, I go to the emergency room and still at this point, they're like, you're fine. They're like, look, like, we did a brain scan last night. There's nothing wrong in your head. You're fine. And my dad was like, she's not fine. They reluctantly agreed to admit me. They still are convinced I'm okay. They're basically all scratching their heads, being like, well, I don't really know what's going on here. They admit me. The next day, the neurologist comes in and basically is like, look, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I'm going to run every test in the book until we figure this out. So the first test they ran was a CTA angiogram, which, if you're unfamiliar, basically injects dye into your veins to light up the veins of your brain. When I go down to get this scan, the nurse giving me the scan even made this comment like, I heard you're fine. I heard you're going home later. And that didn't feel passive aggressive then, but it feels passive aggressive now.
Mm.
Because I mean, everyone was just telling me I was fine, and almost as if I was like faking it. And
Yeah.
so I get the scan, they bring me back to my room, and within like 2 minutes of being back in my room, like three doctors rush into my room. And I was like, okay, something's not right here.
Now
And
they get it.
my doctor looks at me and she goes, you're on birth control pills, right? And I was like, yeah, like they were literally sitting on my table because I had just taken them, because I hadn't taken them the days before because I was so sick. I was like, yeah, what about it? And she looks at me, she goes, you can never again take those in your life.
Mhm.
And I kind of look at her, I'm like, okay. Like I look at my dad looks at me, we both look at her, we're like, okay, like what's going on? She was like, your brain is full of massive blood clots. She goes, you're having a stroke. And also, the scan caught the top part of your lungs, and you also have a pulmonary embolism you're having right now. Um, and at that point, they transferred me to the neuro ICU, and I started treatment. And that's how it basically all went down. But it was a really long ordeal of getting diagnosed, and almost being like gaslit by doctors, and
Mhm.
not believed. And I think that's been what's had the biggest impact on my mental health for sure. But yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when we know something's wrong with our bodies, we know
Yeah.
this isn't normal for us, and we just expect that these people are going to tell us the truth and tell us what's wrong, and we trust them. We put all of our trust in them to know
Yeah.
the answers.
And it's not even just that, but we trust that they will care enough about our lives and find the importance in it to, if they don't know, to care and figure it out. But I just
Right.
felt so dismissed. Like it honestly felt like here I am, like a 24-year-old woman complaining of head pain, and they're like, well, she must just be dramatic. She
Mm-hmm.
must just be anxious. Like she must be fine. And it was like almost like it felt like I was screaming in a crowded room and like no one even looks up.
Yeah, my story is very similar to yours. It took 4 days and three different doctors. And even when I was in hospital, they still said the same. We think you're having a migraine. I
Yeah.
knew I wasn't, but yeah, it does take a toll on you. And you mentioned something earlier, which we will chat about, and that's the mental health in the recovery. But first, let's chat about physical recovery. So you've got to hospital and now you're in ICU. Was your limbs functioning? Did you have to have a rehab program?
So I had a very good physical recovery, and even with how long it took to diagnose me, they still say they caught it fairly early. So in regards of my physical recovery, like in the grand scheme of things, it was, I don't want to say easy because it was anything but easy, but
Mm,
it could have been a lot worse, right? I didn't really have any lasting cognitive or physical impairments at all. I did spend a week in the neuro ICU while I was on treatment. I was getting heparin via IV for that time to try to break up the clot as much as possible. I was getting lots of tests done on my brains, my lungs. They were super closely monitoring me because I was on the heparin. I was really at high risk for brain bleeds and things like
yeah.
that. So after about a week, I was able to go home and transition to treatment at home. But that's kind of where I guess most of my medical care stopped because I didn't really have any lasting deficits. I was still on blood treatments for the next 8 months and was closely monitored with brain scans through that whole time. But that was really it.
And did you get fatigue?
Oh gosh, yes. I kind of thought that once I got released from the hospital, I would just be fine, right? Like they would release me and that meant that I was okay, right? Because if I
Mhm.
wasn't, they wouldn't release me. And that's not what it looked like at all. I went home and I still had horrible head pain. That didn't just miraculously go away. I still had weird symptoms. I still had numbness in my body because that clot was still there. Um, and that was really scary for me, still having those symptoms and just no energy, no appetite, no, like just not feeling like yourself. And honestly, that took months to come back. Like I was out of work for 4 months. I was out of school for 4 months. And that like that whole time my life was just on pause. And in my mind, I thought that just as soon as I survived, that that meant I was okay. Right. And I wasn't. I wasn't okay. Like it, and it's one of those things that it's almost like an invisible injury, right? So other
Mhm.
people can't see it. So no one else really knows it's there. And that made me feel like I was being dramatic or whiny or complaining. But it was like in reality, like I was recovering from a brain injury that
Mm.
no one really could see. I already had felt so gaslit in my diagnosis process, like I wasn't believed. And it was really hard.
And so 4 months it took for you to return to work and study?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I returned to work before I returned to school, I believe. And I returned to work part-time at first for like a month and then full-time. But I remember my first day going back to work, I was like, oh, I shouldn't be here. Like it
Mm.
was like the whole world was spinning. Like I was so overstimulated. It was just, it's honestly like a blur.
Do you find now, almost 3 years later, that you still get that sensory overload?
At times, yeah.
Yeah.
It's still really hard for me, like random little things like Going to the grocery store is really overwhelming for me. All something the biggest lasting, deficit I have for my stroke is my hearing. My hearing is really, really wonky. I pick up on everything. There's lots of whooshing sounds in my ears and different frequencies really trip me out. So going to like any type of crowded, busy area, super overwhelming for me. So I still like I don't go to the grocery store. I do curbside pickup as much as I can. But it's almost like my new normal. I don't really notice it as much anymore. It's just kind of how it is.
You've adjusted and
Yeah,
adjusted really
you
well.
you
And
adapt.
you do. And you said something that's just so important. You know, it's the hidden challenges, those hidden, invisible um, challenges that come with life after stroke that nobody can see. You, people would look at you, they wouldn't know that you've had a stroke unless you've told them, and
Yeah.
but they don't know how you're feeling on the inside.
Yeah. That was really challenging for me. You have the whole physical aspect, right? And
Mm,
even with as good of the physical recoveries I had, there was still lots of challenges that no one else really saw. But then there's the mental aspect of, I just remember so many people being like, aren't you so happy you're alive? Like, you're so lucky. And I remember thinking, like, no, I don't feel happy right now. I don't feel lucky. I feel traumatized. But yet I'm sitting here and everyone's basically looking at me like this survivor that should just be out enjoying life because she's so lucky. But I am just traumatized. I'm terrified of every little thing my body feels. I feel plagued and paralyzed by fear. But everyone's looking at me as if I'm the luckiest girl in the world. And it was extremely challenging to cope with that because I felt so much shame for struggling like I was because I was like, Jenna, like you're alive. Like everyone said, like you should be dead right now and you are alive and you're fine and you're sitting here, what, complaining, traumatized by what happened to you. It was almost like get over it, right? And that was just like honestly the most challenging part for me and something I still to this day really struggle with.
So, with the post-traumatic stress, did you end up seeing a therapist yourself?
I did. It took a while. So I think being in the field of psych myself, I'm a bit jaded, right? It's almost like a doctor going to another doctor. You're like, I know all this, like I'm
Mhm.
fine. It wasn't until gosh, over a year after that I finally went to therapy. Still in therapy, right? It's almost 3 years out at this point, and it's still the main topic of conversation in each of my therapy sessions is my PTSD. Um, and it's made me realize how much it affects every aspect of my life, things that you wouldn't think it would affect, like it really does carry over into every part of your life, that trauma and that fear.
Yeah, um, it does. And for people who are listening, what advice could you give to them if they're feeling the same as you, if they're feeling that post-traumatic stress, if they've lost their identity, if they're looking at themselves thinking, what's wrong with me? I should be happy. I should be
Yeah.
grateful. What advice would you give?
I mean, I would really give two main pieces of advice. The first thing I would tell anyone in this situation is prepare to be struggling a lot. No one prepared me for that. I didn't know that after I survived, I would have the challenges I did because no one talks about it, right? When you hear about
Mhm.
stroke recovery, everyone talks about the physical aspect and you assume that's the only aspect. You assume once you're fine physically, you're just going to be fine. That's not the case. So I think every stroke survivor should know when they go into it, like it's going to be really tough. There are these challenges you're going to face because I just honestly didn't anticipate it. Um, and no one talks about it. And I think secondly, which there's one thing I hate, it's toxic positivity. I hate just smiling through things or being like everything happens for a reason, right?
Mhm.
I think I hate it, honestly. But I think if you can find the good in a really bad situation, then there's nothing toxic about it. And I think it takes time for that to come. But I think in my situation, I've been able to take like arguably the worst thing that's ever happened to me and I've turned it into being the best thing that's ever happened to me. Like it truly did. As much as my stroke traumatized me, it really taught me a lot. I'm forever grateful for it because it changed who I am. It changed how I live my life. But I'm hesitant to, give that advice because that borders on the line of like everything happens for a reason. It takes a long time to get to where I'm at mentally.
Mhm.
But I've taken that one thing that nearly broke me and I've made it my strength. I found strength in it. And I think just finding perspective in it is really valuable, and being able to look at things and be like, all right, well, that did nearly kill me, but what good came out of it? While also acknowledging the bad, because you can't diminish that or minimize that at all, because I think that's what I tried to do for a long time and that didn't do me any good.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. The toxic positivity that can be very doubly invalidating. Like we have to realize
Yeah.
that the post-stroke journey, while we may want to go back to the person we were prior to our strokes, it is a journey along the way, and there are going to be bad days. So lean into those bad days, and I love what you've done, where when they show up, what can I learn from it? How can I get better? What can I do? How can I cope better?
Yeah.
Um, Something that I was wondering is, you said you were staying with your parents at the time that this was going on. Were they really supportive, and did you have a support network afterwards?
My parents and my family were so incredibly supportive during, after my they advocated for me when I was in the hospital and I couldn't advocate for myself. They always believed me. They're truly the best people. And then afterwards, they were incredibly supportive, which I'm so thankful for. Even though, obvious that this wasn't something they had ever gone through, they couldn't empathize with me in that way. They really were so supportive during my mental recovery, where I think it could be so easy for them to not be, or
Mm-hmm.
to have that mindset of just you're fine, right? Like you're
Mm.
so lucky, you're fine, like be thankful. They were never like that. They heard everything I was saying, everything I went through. They were with me every step of the way. Still to this day, like my PTSD really gets me. The whole month of April, I was a mess. And what, that's 2.5 years after my stroke. My dad stayed with me like almost every night. I
Oh,
live an
that's
hour away
amazing.
from him. He drove to me after work, drove back into where he lives for work, and just stayed with me just so I wouldn't be alone. Like they're the most supportive people, and I am so extremely grateful for it. And I am just so glad I have them because I know not everyone does. And I don't know how I would have recovered had I not had my supportive parents with me every step of the way.
That's really nice to hear. And that just having them there, I mean, it really helps with your emotional well-being,
For sure.
having them there. Did you find support in stroke groups at all?
So I joined a survivors group a couple months after my stroke when I started to just have these mental challenges. And I will say I think there is good and bad that comes from it. I always thought with my process to diagnosis and kind of what happened to me that that was not normal, that I
Mm-hmm.
just had a really bad experience.
Mm-hmm.
When I joined a survivors group, I learned that that was pretty standard.
Mm-hmm.
Stroke diagnosis looks almost identical to what I went through, especially for young women.
Yeah.
Um, and I thought that would comfort me in a way, knowing that everyone else kind of went through this too, but it made it a lot worse because I was like, everyone else went through this too. Like, this
Mm-hmm.
isn't just a me problem, it's an everyone problem. And that was really hard for me to realize like that this is a much bigger problem than me, because then I was like, okay, well, what do I do about it? How do I fix it? Like someone else is going to deal with the same thing I did.
Mm.
And that, it's one of those things that I think for some people that would provide comfort and a feeling of not being alone. But for me, it was very discouraging in a very deep way to know that like my story wasn't different. This is how it happens for most everyone. And that was just almost just like, it felt so heavy. Like, okay, well, now what? How do we fix a problem that's so much bigger than me,
Yeah.
that's so ingrained in our healthcare system? Like, how do you fix that? And I think that was really challenging for me.
Yeah. And I completely relate to that. And we're not even in the same country. And,
Yeah.
my experience was pretty similar to yours. And I've come across so many of the same. And I think how we can help to change it is by having these conversations and getting it out
Yeah.
there and making people aware, especially, like you said, in young women. And I mean, because we don't all present the same. We don't all present
Yeah.
with the speech or the hemi paralysis. There are those headaches are a major sign and a warning sign that something is not right.
Yeah. I think that that's been I think something I found a lot of healing in is just sharing my story and talking about it. I've connected with a lot of other stroke survivors on TikTok, and I think,
Mhm.
you know, there's power in numbers, and I think just anytime I can advocate for what happened to me, if I can, my biggest thing is it's very clear to me what happened now. From the start, it was clearly a stroke. It is a textbook CVST stroke. I didn't know that. I'll never understand how the doctors didn't know that, but all I can worry about is me. But if I had had the knowledge that I have now, then I wouldn't have changed the outcome. I still would have had my stroke, right? But I could have saved myself a lot of trauma and fear that it took in getting diagnosed. And that's my biggest thing is like, because my stroke was caused from hormonal birth control pills. Every woman on hormonal birth control pills should know the signs and symptoms of strokes and blood clots. I didn't.
Yeah,
Everyone should know that. Like I was on the pill for 8 years and I was fine. And then it happened. Like it can happen to anyone. And knowledge is power. And it can not just save your life, but save you so much trauma that I went
yeah.
through. And that's my biggest thing.
Did you have migraines prior to your stroke?
I am hesitant to call them migraines, but I had pretty decent headaches.
Yeah, there's a reason why I asked, but I'll chat to you about it after we finish. Um, Before we do go, though, is there anything that you would like to add or any advice that you would like to give to anybody who's listening right now?
I mean, I just want to say, like, for anyone that's, just had a stroke or you're on the stroke recovery, it does get better. I know for me, like when I was in the thick of my PTSD, like I could not see that. I couldn't see a day where I wouldn't be as paralyzed by fear as what I was. And I think knowing that eventually it does get better is helpful. And like, you're going to have bad days, but eventually the good days will start to outnumber the bad days until you don't remember your last bad day. And then inevitably you'll have another bad day and it'll happen again because I don't think healing is a place where there's a destination and an endpoint where you're just going to be fine. Like I have accepted at this point, I'm going to deal with this for the rest of my life, the fears that this has left me with. But I think knowing that I've survived each of my bad days and that I've had good days after them is helpful. Just knowing like I, this is normal. It's normal to struggle after a stroke. It's normal for your mental health to be really, really awful after a stroke. And just because
Mhm.
no one talks about it doesn't mean we're not all dealing with it. So,
I love that advice. I love that it is so important to talk about your mental health, that we all go through it, and that wherever you are on your post-stroke journey, that things can get better. So take it all in. And I thank you so much for coming on today and
yeah,
sharing your experiences. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
me too.
Um, so I will we'll chat again soon.